Scano. My name is Jeff Doctor. I'm Kaiga from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, for those that don't know where that is. I'm Haudenosaunee. We are spread out all throughout Turtle Islands, but my community, Six Nations of the Grand River, we are just southwest of so-called Toronto, or Toronto, in Ontario, or so-called Ontario in so-called Canada. Um, I'm an impact strategist at Animikii Indigenous Tech, and a lot of the work that I do is focused on the ethics of technology, thinking about the impact of all the things that we create. And Animikii in particular, a lot of what we do is custom software. So when it comes to building the custom software, how do we ensure that that is actually done by us, for us, in ways that, are ultimately supporting Indigenous nation rebuilding? So when it came to this talk of developing sovereignty in tech, this is something I've always been super interested in talking about. And I was thinking a lot of how can Animikii kind of contribute into this conversation? And I was like, well, I guess we can just show what it is that we do. Unfortunately, Sam won't be joining us today. She is unavailable because real life is complicated and finding schedules to record at the same time didn't turn out. So you're kind of stuck with me. Now, that said, this is pre recorded. So Sam hopefully will be joining us at the actual conference. And if she is, when this is being actually shown, she might be there in the chat with you there. So either way, she'll be there, or I'll be there, or both of us, and we'll be able to answer your questions throughout. So feel free to drop any questions or comments or anything like that in the chats. And I'm looking forward to talking to y'all throughout this conference. So today's talk about pathfinding. And really, ultimately, what this is avoiding techno-solutionism in Indigenous nation rebuilding. So where this comes from my perspective, is working in community and being constantly frustrated by the lack of technology that has been built with Indigenous needs in mind. And you really see this in, when you're working in so-called Canada, what we're often called, band councils or First Nations, where there's a lot of software that is made by outsiders, non-Indigenous folks, to support our data governance, but it's clear that a lot of it was never really built with our needs in mind. And so Animikii has been doing this kind of work for a long time to figure out how we actually build things properly by us, for us. And this is one aspect of this. So today's presentation is broken down into the following parts. First of all, what is this thing, pathfinding? I'm going to say this word a lot, and I'll be explaining what it means in a bit, and explaining why that we do it. Further, what are the pathfinding protocols? And then, how is pathfinding actually done? So how does this unfold? What does this look like? What's the process look like? So we're going to be kind of opening up to the public how it is that we do these things for the first time. So kind of nervous about this because, it's a lot of work that we've done in private. And the hope is that by showing y'all how we do it, then it can inspire y'all to, take some of these things, do it yourself as you're building your own tech. So let's just jump right into it, because ultimately, at the end of the day, our larger philosophy behind this is moving slow and empowering people. This is kind of the opposite of that classic tech bro dogma of move fast and break things. Obviously, when it comes to working in, any kind of space with vulnerable people or indigenous tech, moving fast and breaking things can hurt people, and that is not what we want to do. So, what's pathfinding? Why do we do it? First, a very quick history of Animikii. I've been here for about 3 years, but the company itself was started by Jeff Ward in about 2003, give or take. A lot of what he was doing was building websites, building databases, doing a lot of custom work, because again, a lot of stuff out there, definitely back then and even now, was not really built with our needs in mind, so everything had to be custom. But because it has to be custom, it takes a lot of time to do things, and it's expensive. So how can we not necessarily standardize, that's not the right word, but as we're developing software that's similar for similar kinds of problems, how can we both build the framework of the software itself so you're not constantly recoding the same thing over and over again, but also how can you systematize or create like a methodology for building like custom software solutions in community for community. And a lot of this is a direct response to like what I would call the entrenched colonialism of tech. So all y'all that are in this conference, I'm sure, have endless stories of what it's like working in tech and what it's like to deal with just the, you know, colonialism in all the words, colonialism in so much of the attitudes, all this notion of extraction and exploitation, and so many things that are in mainstream tech that are super harmful and frustrating. And so, obviously, as an indigenous tech company, this is the opposite of what we want to do and what we're fighting against with everything that we create. And what that means is that we don't have the luxury to just like, build something and throw it out there. We have to do an impact assessment. We have to figure out how that we build this and what's the consequences of what we build. How is that actually going to impact people? And, then we've got the classic kind of product visioning, like what are we making? Why are we making it? Who are we making for? And what's that going to look like? And then, classic project planning, building any kind of technology or any kind of software, especially the more custom that it is, can be very complicated, can be very expensive. Sometimes we're talking about multi-year projects that can be even multi-million dollars, which then speaks to fundraising. As I'm sure many of y'all can relate to, like money in this field is not distributed equitably, and often the people that need it the most aren't the ones getting it. And so in so many times we've had to justify everything that we do to often colonial gatekeepers to fund all of these projects. And how do we do that in a language that they, I hate to say, but like respect and listen to, that still isn't watering things down? So again, the idea is we got to move slow, we got to empower people. Now, when I say move slow, that's not, move super slow because things still need to get done, but it's more a matter of being considerate, being thoughtful, being careful, and at the end of the day, this is about empowerment software. And even when I'm saying people, I'm not necessarily meaning just like human beings, but all of our kin, all of our animal relations, all of our, what's often called like the natural world, land, water, the trees, the plants, everything that we live in and live with, are also peoples to a degree, and we have to ensure that perhaps they're being empowered through some of this tech as well, because ultimately this is what we want to avoid. This notion of, technology that is this expansion of like the light of the Western glory that moves, Western European, I should say, glory that drives, us away because of all this narrative of progress and manifest destiny and all these things. That I use this image in literally all my presentations because it is, to me, such a prime illustration of technology from a certain worldview that is like literally driving indigenous people away. So what we need to do in a lot of ways is the opposite of this. And one way of doing that is through protocol. So what are these pathfinding protocols? Well, first, simple stuff like meeting rules. So we're building things with other people. This isn't just Animikii that is just looking at stuff on our own and then building it. We have to build things in community with the people that we're ultimately building it for and with. And in any kind of meeting space, you need rules. So this is simple stuff y'all are probably used to, is like, not interrupting people, acting with respect, treating people well, and empathizing with everyone's situation, giving everyone a space to speak. The facilitator role in this pathfinding process, part of that role is also just good hosting, ensuring everyone is comfortable, everyone has their needs met, because this has to be a safe space. So much of what we're dealing with, many of the things that we're talking about, can be very triggering, can be very distressing. And sure, we're building software and tech, but like why are we building it? Who are we building it for? And what is the actual situation on the ground? And sometimes that situation's pretty grim that we're responding to. So we have to ensure that in the process itself isn't causing harm, and just setting basic meeting rules is a big part of that. Because ultimately, in the day, this is about partnerships. This is about co-creation of software and technology, because we want to avoid the classic techno-solutionism of, we're this company and we have all the answers, and that's we just got to find a quote market that, will be able to we'll be able to saturate with all of our magic glory, like the classic idea of, everything when you're a hammer is a nail. Like, that's not what we want to do. We have certain skills, we have certain tech stacks that we work on and specialize in, but at the end of the day, this is about co-creation. This is about building things with the people. So what that means really at the end of the day is sharing. And it's about listening and understanding the needs, the desires, the hopes, the dreams, all the aspects of our partners' lives that go into what we're building this for. We have to understand that. And the only way to do that is a mixture of everyone sharing, but for sharing to be done properly, people have to listen. This includes us and includes our partners. This is a two-way relationship. And sometimes, 3 or 4-way, depending on the complexity of some of these partnerships. If we're dealing with multiple, communities or multiple parties to build a really complicated technological project, that is a lot of shared work. And again, going back to rules, going back to protocols, going back to the general notion of co-creation is super important to all of this. Because at the end of the day, ultimately it's our partners and the users themselves that are really the experts of their lives. And what we're trying to do is create like a technological intervention that ultimately is what they want, what they need, and will benefit them, empower them, if you want to use that language. So how is this done? 6 phases. I'll be going into all the details of this in a bit. This is just an overview. And each phase builds upon the next in a consensus building process. And what I mean by consensus building is that with each phase, because we're working not in opposition, we're working in collaboration, but there are different sides to this. So if you think about this, like you've got the Animikii side, and then you've got the partner that we're working with, they both have different sides that they're bringing things into this relationship. And we both know things that the other side might not. And so that could create, I'm not going to say conflict, but sometimes they have certain needs, we have certain needs, and we have to find a consensus in how to meet everybody's needs at the end of the day. This can be sometimes really mundane stuff, just like, when is stuff due, or how much is it going to cost, or like, when are we going to start building X, Y, and Z? But also more abstract things like, what's this feature going to look like? Like, how important is it to build this in this order? All these aspects of things we have to ultimately agree on because, again, we're co-developing, we're building together. And so largely what we do in Pathfinding is listening and reflecting back what we heard. So much of this process is about asking questions, a lot of questions, and listening carefully to them, and then reflecting them back in a report. So again, the partners know that we're actually hearing what they're saying. So again, we're not this kind of top-down, we have all the answers. We have to listen incredibly carefully and then be able to articulate a lot of different views, a lot of different voices to come up with ultimately one solid idea for like a software development plan. Because at the end of the day, we always have to learn and we always have to iterate on this because the process itself, it has to be fluid. Every time we do a pathfinding project, we learn from it. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we find, hey, if we did this a little bit differently, or we tried it this way, or, this new person was brought onto the team and they've got new ideas, let's just bring that into the process. Let's iterate on this. And then, so because often we're working on multiple projects at the same time, the idea is that everybody can benefit from this because an improvement, with this project can roll over to the other projects that we're working with. There's no need to keep things exclusive. So this is largely what pathfinding looks like. It, as you can see here, and you probably have to squint real hard, and I'll be zooming in on each of these in a bit, but this is actually a Miro board. So if you don't know what Miro is, it is effectively it's like a virtual whiteboard, and what that is like, if you know, in a physical whiteboard, you can put sticky notes, you can put like pieces of paper, you can put stuff on a big board. We used to do that pre-pandemic, and we wish that we could go back to that, and we're still trying to figure out how we can. But at this point, we're doing a kind of we're doing all virtual right now with all of our pathfinding sessions, but we're still thinking about how can we transition back into perhaps a hybrid environment. So as you can see here, each of these little kind of blocks are actually, those are full-size pages like that you can print out. And the idea is that the red sections on the left represent each phase, and then as we move through each phase, you're moving from left to right. This will make a little bit more sense in a bit. So the first phase is the kickoff. This is where we define the project. This is where we determine deliverables and contracts and figuring out the kind of initial deadlines, because at the end of the day, we have to ensure that we're all in alignment with not only how we are going to work together, but what are all the expectations for this project. And then we actually start getting into the actual pathfinding itself. So the first phase is what we call the overview. This is when we're trying to understand the context, understand the larger picture to why we're doing this, who ultimately we're supporting, and what is it that we're aiming to achieve. So all of our meetings start with a check-in. And sometimes, depending on the context, we'll even start with a traditional opening. Because I'm Haudenosaunee, often we start our meetings with a Thanksgiving address or the words that come before all others. We find this is a very good grounding exercise to ensure that we're all like of one mind, because we start consensus building with a shared upon agreement of reality. And in the Thanksgiving address, it's like literally just going and giving thanks to like all the things, you know, the plants, the animals, like the moon, the sun, like all aspects of creation that we're thankful and we're grateful for. I would like to think that everybody in that meeting agrees with. So far, it hasn't been the case otherwise. But at the same time, if we're working, in another community and we've got elders or we've got traditional knowledge keepers, it's contextual who would be appropriate to start the process, start the meeting. So we want to ensure that every time we start a new pathfinding project, we're doing so in a way that's culturally appropriate. And one quick way to start with that is just the notion of working in circle. Every culture treats circles differently, the order of speaking in a circle. So like in Western culture, you think of, quote, clockwise, going from right to left around the circle. In Haudenosaunee culture, it's the opposite. We go the other way around. Meanwhile, our neighbors, the Anishinaabe, they go, the other way around. So this is a good kind of like both an icebreaker, but also, again, a way to understand protocol of the folks we're working with is which direction in a speaking order in the circle are we going to go with, quote unquote clockwise or counterclockwise. Once we determine that, we put everybody's name in the circle. We've got the direction of the circle that we're going to go. And then we want to kind of get an idea of where everybody's at. So how are people feeling? And if people want to, we can start. It's not like a sharing circle, but it's more like just a way to center everybody if they want to share. Just because, again, like this is virtual, it's kind of hard to determine where people are feeling. We want to get an idea if people are super nervous, if people are just like, really excited and anxious, or people like just having a bad day, not feeling it, and that's okay too. Because we ultimately, again, have to build consensus, and it's important to know where everybody's at in the start of the meeting. So ideally, everybody's all energized and happy, but, if they're not, that's fine. It's totally okay. We just have to, work through these things together. So we start with a whole bunch of questions right off the bat. We call this the executive summary. This is often what you see like the one-pager. So the report itself that we produce at the end of this can be upwards of like 30, 40 pages, depending on the complexity. And the executive summary is where we try to take this whole pathfinding process, which can go over months, sometimes be up to 6 months to do all this and condense it all into one page, because we're all busy people, time is a luxury, and to really understand everything, sometimes just having that very quick overview is super essential. So this is where we start getting an idea of where we're at in this project. So, you know, basic questions like, what's your organization's story and purpose? We want to understand who we're working with, why they're doing what they're doing, and a little bit of backgrounds about them, because we work ultimately internationally with a lot of very different people and peoples, and we can't assume that we know everything about them just by what's on a website. Sometimes they don't have necessarily a web presence, and so the only way to really understand where they're coming from is just to ask. So then we start thinking about, okay, what is it that we're building? What kind of tech is this? Is this like a learning management system? Is this like a data governance system? Is this like a streaming system? Is this like are we going to be like hosting videos? Like what kind of software is this? And then what's the initiative that this is all a part of? It's kind of like the why are we building this as part of like a larger initiative of that nation or that community or that government or whatever. And then we want to just ask directly, like, okay, who's going to benefit from this? Very directly, and how? So this is when we start thinking about like what's usually called like the audience, the people that would be using the application. You could call these users, but at this point, we're still thinking at the end of the day, okay, who ultimately is benefiting from this? And then what are the goals that they're looking to achieve through this software? Also through the project itself or part of the initiative. These things get all kind of blended together, but we're trying to keep an open mind of, if we had all the money in the world, all the resources in the world, what is it that we're looking to achieve through this software? And then it gets into features. Okay, so you know what goals you're trying to achieve. Well, what do you need to meet those goals? What features are part of the software that you desire or you think your users, all these people that are going to benefit from the software, what's that going to look like? So, what is the executive summary? Again, it's that one pager, and this is kind of like a sample of an executive summary that we distilled from like the meeting notes in the last little section here. So for the purposes of this presentation, I made like a little bit of a demo. I'm not going to fill in like all the blanks for all the sticky notes throughout this whole thing because that's a lot. But let's say for this presentation, this is like an indigenous nation that we're building this for. And we're building like a data governance system because, the theme developing sovereignty and tech, this just seems to fit. And what are they doing? Why are they doing it? What initiative is this a part of? Well, this is part of like the ethical stewardship of their data. So who's the audiences? Well, obviously like the citizens. This gets messy, like what term you want to use, like citizens, members. Again, this is all culturally dependent, how people identify themselves and their people. Yeah, I'm not going to get into that debate here, but and then of course, so we're thinking about audiences. These are kind of like generic sets of users that we don't necessarily like super rigidly defined, but we're starting to think of like categories of kinds of users that might have different goals, might need different things, and also might need different priorities. Because, oops, I hit the wrong button. Because again, as we're building indigenous tech, sometimes we have to ensure that, again, the people that we're ultimately supporting are getting the benefit out of this. And we don't want, I'm not going to say the wrong people to benefit from things, but we still have to always think about like who are the people, most impacted by this, or who are the people we're really concerned about having their needs met, the primary audience. And in this case, if this is about, citizens' data, like they should be the primary audience. That's the number one group of people we're really thinking about supporting here. So in this case, we're thinking about ultimately like, citizens, they need, their government is managing their data, and as citizens, they want, access. They want control of some of this data. They want visibility about what information their government or their representatives or whatever term you want to use has on them or with them or for them, and how can they access it? What can they contribute? Because so many times, like our quote unquote governments may have like just really not a lot of information about their citizens for lots of different reasons I'm not going to get into here. But how can they build like, you know, not this kind of like top down like surveillancy kind of like, you know, culture, but a way that the citizens themselves can contribute and collaborate on information about them. And so this could be features like, you know, uploading data, updating like stuff about them, like even basic stuff like, you know, address and phone details and things like that. They're changing all the time. How can we give like, you know, the citizens the agency to determine what aspects of information they want to share with their government? And then the government itself, when we're thinking about them as a user, you know, you call this leadership. Up here in so-called Canada, we think of like chief and council, at least in the band council system. But this could be traditional leadership as well. This could be any form of leadership that ultimately that community, you know, decides. And then the people administering it. So, you know, you can think of like admin, the people that have to, you know, work in the quote unquote band office or whatever aspect of government, the indigenous version of bureaucrats, if you want to put it that way. How are they managing this data? How do we make their work easier? How do we ensure that they do their job effectively as data stewards so that, you know, they can manage this data effectively, but also pass on reliable information to their leaders, to the leaders of the nation, so that, you know, they're operating with the best information that they have. So they need different features. They need, you know, they need different kinds of workflows. They need to ensure that, you know, the data is safe and secure and they are ethically stewarding it. And then other audiences, stuff like that, are like, you know, outside entities. So this could be settler governments, this could be other nations, this could be businesses, stuff like that. When we're thinking about how many interactions with outsiders on our territories that also need information about our territories, that's a different kind of audience. And, you know, there's information sharing that should ultimately be happening between these folks. So this is where APIs and this is where information sharing agreements can come in, and how can potentially the software have those kinds of features that data is still secure and held by that nation to ensure that nation's data sovereignty is respected, but how can they be the ones to determine what outside entities get to see? Then, you know, there's the general public. So this could be settlers, this could be indigenous people, this could be anybody that just wants to know more about the nation, wants to know what resources are available about, you know, treaties, or what's the history, what's the relationship. There's so many places where settlers have no idea anything about the indigenous peoples whose territory they reside on, or stole, or steal, or whatever term you want to use. They don't know a damn thing, and it's not the responsibility of indigenous peoples to, you know, satisfy settler ignorance. But there's things that we can put out there to, you know, raise awareness, public education, things of that sort. So that could be like a more of a public side to this application. So again, this is just a theoretical application I'm just using for the purpose of this presentation. And this is just like a sample of a one-pager of kind of high-level audiences, features, goals, and that ultimately when this is written down in like one sheet of paper, it's just like, oh, okay, I totally get why this application is super important. So here's where we start transitioning into something that's probably different than most other software companies. So this is when we're thinking about rights and responsibilities. So whose rights ultimately is this project supporting, and what responsibilities do we have to these rights? So in the we here is like, could be anything from the developers, the people working on this project, but also really anyone involved using this software. Everybody's got a responsibility to respect and maintain certain rights. So here in so-called Canada, we've got the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. We've got the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two Spirits calls for justice. And of course, at the international level, we've got UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So UNDRIP is largely rights-based, and the calls to action, calls for justice, are also in a lot of ways rights-based, but also they're just tangible things that need to be done. And so by identifying them, by making them very explicit in this project, we can not only provide context for the why that we're doing this, but we can also recognize so much work has been done in these like so many different reports and guidelines and things of that sort, that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel. We're actioning these things. We're actually doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, and we can be doing this through software, through tech. So UNDRIP Article 31, that's talking a lot about, like, in a way, UNDRIP's version of data sovereignty, and it talks about like the rights of Indigenous peoples, like their culture, their data, their information, all these kinds of things. So this is a good kind of standard that Animikii uses. Call to Action 92 in TRC is about businesses, how businesses should ultimately be respecting UNDRIP in everything that they do. So if that's the case, why isn't that happening in software development? And then the calls for justice 15.6 and 15.7, those are talking a lot about like vulnerable populations, talking about when we're doing things, how do we ensure that, that women, that different aspects of the population that are marginalized the most, which again I'm not going to get into here, but needs to be considered like very heavily when we're building software, because again we have to ensure that we're not doing harm, and we have to be very careful to identify where that harm's coming from and who's being marginalized or being excluded. So this is just like a quick sample again of different rights that we should be thinking about with, again, this sample software. So we could be thinking about citizens, we could think about clans and houses and families, also Indigenous peoples, and where do Indigenous peoples' general rights come from, and also about human rights. Then again, we're thinking about women's rights, children's rights, two-spirit folks' rights, and like, rights of folks of LGBTQ plus communities. These are a lot of different intersecting and overlapping rights that we need to be cognizant of when we're building software, because again, we don't want to do harm. We want to ensure what are the basic minimum standards for treating each other well in this world, and what responsibilities do we have to that. So things like, following Indigenous laws, respecting traditions, respecting UNDRIP and basic human rights, respecting labor rights. How can we do all these kinds of things so that when we're building tech, we're not inadvertently causing the very same harm we're trying to get away from? And then I've also identified just a bunch of calls to action, calls for justice, and UNDRIP articles that are common for this kind of software. I'm not going to get into the why of those, but feel free to look them up. So again, thinking about rights and responsibilities, this itself can be an endless rabbit hole. And the biggest reason we put this right off the bat is because, folks working in tech often, could be developers, could be coders, could be just like people that are not necessarily trained in, let's say, the human aspect of the world. They might not be thinking about stuff like human rights or Indigenous rights. They're just thinking about lines of code. And so how do we hold folks, like everybody in this project, accountable for these basic standards that have been identified in so many places? Not only to just not do harm, but to, basic respect for people's dignity and respect for so much work that has been done in these sectors, and how do we build off of them? So again, because we're working ultimately internationally in a lot of ways, we have to be thinking about principles and values. So Animikii is an impact corp. We are always thinking about, like, as a company that's driven by our values. These are the Anishinaabe 7 grandfather teachings of humility, truth, honesty, courage, respect, wisdom, and love. So those come from Anishinaabe culture because our founder is Anishinaabe. But while that's like our company official values, and then what are detailed in the little sticky notes are like, how we act those out in this project, we often, that's like our side of the table. It's like Animiki's side of things. This is how we do things. These are our values. This is the why we do things in certain ways. But how do our partners do things? What teachings or principles, laws, things of that sort from their side ultimately guide this project? because at the end of the day, this is a partnership. We have to understand where our values align, where maybe they could differ a little bit, and where any potential conflicts could be. So it's usually not the case. Usually we have a lot more in common than we think, and it's just a matter of respect and navigating cross-cultural dynamics that is very important to identify right off the bat when you're working internationally. So I am not going to fill in a lot more things in this template because kind of out of time, and I'm trying to more show the pathfinding process rather than go into too much of a sample. But I wanted to fill in at least some of the blanks to give you all an idea of how we fill these in. So the next section here is measuring success. This is important not only from an impact perspective, but from any technological intervention. How do you know you've been successful? What is it that makes the software successful? And how will you know? Will you know you succeeded? Because again, to move beyond just like harm, how do we build something but know that we actually did what we were setting out to do? It's important. And from an Indigenous perspectives, this is extra important when it comes to respecting like Indigenous data sovereignty. So this gets into a whole can of worms I'm not going to open up in this presentation, but one big thing to think about is like the care principles for Indigenous data stewardship. So this is thinking about like collective benefit of data collection. Who has the authority to control these data? What responsibilities do we have to these data? And what are the ultimate ethics underlying all of these things? How do we consider all this when we're considering success of software and software development? And in terms of measuring that, there's so many different metrics and guidelines and things of this of like impact measurement. This is just one I find pretty good is the Montreal Declaration on Impact Assessment, or something. I might be getting that wrong, and the screen is too tiny, I can't see it. But things that we're thinking about here is like, especially for folks that their funding is based on metrics or KPIs or like key performance indicators. How do we ensure that as we're measuring the success of the project, we're not just like chasing measurements? Like we're not just trying to, meet funders' needs. Ultimately, we really need to be careful about what success looks like and how do we measure it so that any of these metrics are like actually useful, that we're actually learning from the metrics, that we're not just taking this like one size fits all approach, because every kind of every new software development will have different kind of ways to measure whether it's successful or not. And at the end of the day, we don't want to just like, again, chase metrics just for the sake of it. So here's where we start getting into some of the more critical aspects of software development. So we don't really have the time or the space to do a full like risk assessment, or like a formal risk assessment during pathfinding. Instead, we start identifying a lot of high-level potential issues. So these are things that like in the project environment, for example, like, when we're dealing with certain people, when we're dealing with certain contexts, where's like the aspects of risks, of potential harms that could come in from this kind of project. And then there's the technical risk. This is the more, classic stuff you think about with technology when you're thinking about like data breaches or privacy, or even things like, pages moving, like not loading fast enough. All the hard technical stuff are other kinds of issues that we need to identify, we need to think about, we need to explore, stuff like hosting, stuff like bandwidth, stuff like, again, we have to understand what are all the technical needs of that community, and then how do they align with the actual project environment needs. So like the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. The people are just as important as all the technical aspects of things. Then there's accessibility, and this is accessibility from folks with a lot of different ways of perceiving this world and a lot of different physical abilities. So I'm not going to get too much into this slide, but we're thinking about the WCAG, was it the AAA accessibility requirements of W3C org. So this is not like my strength, so I'm kind of rambling here, but this is the aspects of, as we're building stuff, we have to ensure that we're meeting these basic accessibility standards. And how do I identify that on desktop applications and on mobile applications? And then we're also starting to think about, okay, hosting requirements. One of the classic aspects of data sovereignty is like, where's the data residing? Whose servers is this going to be on? Can it cross borders? Or can it be in the cloud, but it needs to be like super encrypted? Then we also need to start exploring like, what's the actual tech stack? So what's this going to be built on? What languages it's going to use? What kind of again, I'm not a developer. I'm not like the super technical person. My background is in techno-sociology, the squishy, the side of tech, not the actual hard stuff. So I'm not going to list a whole bunch of different software stuff. People in this conference are way better and more equipped for that than me. So yeah. And now we can start thinking about, okay, like the development timeline. So in a perfect magical world, we would get stuff done super fast. But that doesn't always work out. Often there's different funding arrangements, there's different complexities in terms of getting everybody in the same room together. There's so many different aspects of why maybe we don't want to launch things right away. Maybe we've got like a longer time scale, or maybe we do need to launch things right away. We've got different urgencies. So here's where we start, idolizing, like, if we had all the resources, if we got all of our ducks in a row, like, when would we actually want to build this and launch this or have this out in the public? How long is it going to take? And it's also about, managing those expectations. And then from a project management perspective, we need to start thinking about key dates, deadlines, any of these kinds of details. Again, especially if the people we're working with are beholden to outside funders, and those funders are setting deadlines. Like, we have to ensure that we're meeting them. And this last, second last aspect of really the project that's all throughout our project is what we called shared language. So these are like key terms. These are all the different relations between terms, but these are also the words that we don't say. So that ultimately, at the end of the day, we're both understanding each other, but we're also respecting each other. So these are all so many terms in tech are confusing that, again, if you're not coming from a technical background, how do you share a language so that non-technical people can understand it? That's the technical kind of stuff, right? Then there's the project terms. So as we're working in a certain context, what are all these wacky like jargon or like terms that are involved in this specific project? Then there's the general terms. It's like if you're working in so-called Canada, you're thinking about like First Nations, Inuit, Métis folks. Like, what do those terms mean? If you're working down south, like, and you're using words like Native American, you're using words like tribe, stuff like this. Like, how do you define these kinds of things? But also the bigger issues, like, if you're dealing with residential school survivors, like, what does that mean? What language is important that you're not inadvertently harming anyone by using incorrect or harmful terms? Like, we need to identify these things. We need to understand that not everybody in the project will be coming from the same understanding of not only the context we're all working in, but just like words that we use. And then the last parts, usually of our first pathfinding session, if we have time. I forgot to mention each pathfinding session, there's 3 of them, takes usually about 3 hours. And so each of these little slides I've gone through in this last section, we try to get through all these, but as you can see, like, often we run out of time. There's usually never enough time, especially if we have a lot of people in the room, and we're constantly figuring out, what's the right time? How much time does it take to do these things? How do we give the time that it needs to have these discussions? So these kinds of questions, we're often thinking throughout the entire process. We're always looking at other kinds of software that are available out there. We're thinking about their limitations. We're thinking about, like, if we're building custom software, like, why are we doing it if other software that's similar already exists? Are we trying to do stuff that those other software can't? Are we trying to understand what's the limitations of the existing market and how are we getting around that? And then, this can be just high-level brainstorming of stuff you throw into, of like, what general ideas do you just have? What are the what we call like blue sky thinking, the big dreams that maybe we haven't identified yet in these conversations? And then lastly, as part of, again, all of our meetings, we want to make sure that we're checking out in a good way. So this could be, the basic steps of project management. How do we ensure the project keeps moving forward? But also, what else can we do? Who else should we be bringing into these conversations? And then, how are we feeling about all this? Again, it's important that we're not ending any of these sessions or any of these meetings on a really negative note. We want everyone to be feeling excited, feeling hopeful, feeling that, we're going in the right direction. So we can just kind of ask this point blank. So this is just a sample. So usually, after the first pathfinding session, we take back everything that we just discussed and we start condensing it into a single report. So Animikii will start working on the first draft. We'll start scheduling the next pathfinding session, and we start thinking through, okay, again, who else should we be bringing into these conversations? What other research should we be doing? What kind of desktop research should we be doing in the meantime? What other kinds of software are out there? There's a lot that we could be thinking about in between the pathfinding sessions. And again, thinking about funding. So we've got some ideas, maybe we've already got some funding, but maybe there's other funding opportunities out there. Because what often we find is that there's a lot of things we want to do with this software. We only have enough money to do this, and how do we phase this appropriately? And again, when it comes to how people are feeling, we want to make sure everyone is feeling comfortable, hopefully feeling excited, hopefully feeling that this is in the right direction, and how we continue moving through this process. Now, I stopped the recording, I looked at the time, and it's 45 minutes in, so I realized I've been talking too much. So apologies that the next parts of this presentation move pretty fast, but I want to respect everyone's time, and there's still some things we need to get through here. So next phase, we just talked about the first phase is all about the overview, the why, the who, the what, the when, where. Now we're thinking about the actual users, the people who we're building this for, their needs, their hopes, their goals, their dreams, their desires. How can we ultimately serve them best through this custom software? Often this is called UX, UI, user design, user experience. We do a light version of that, but usually the more deeper version of that is actually in the development process. Right now we're just still doing a high level needs assessment. So again, we start with the check-in, start with the circle order, get a feel for everybody's kind of vibes in the space, and then we start moving into the different audiences. We want to understand who we're building this for. So we want to understand, a little bit about them, basic descriptions, a little bit of details, facts, and stuff like that. And also demographics, goals, frustrations, needs, also technical access. Where are people's skills, but also what kind of technical equipment do they have available to them? Again, from an audience perspective, these aren't individual users, these are groups of users, different kinds of audiences. So we can think in terms of user roles. So user roles is a little bit different than user personas. We usually do user personas later on in the process, but right now we're thinking largely in terms of information architecture. So this is things like user permissions. Who can see what, who can do what, who has access to what. So a user role could be something like an admin or a public user or a citizen user that needs access to certain kinds of data. Questions we ask are kind of normal UI UX questions. Whose life are we ultimately improving with this? What's their goals? What are their challenges? What is motivating them to use this software, and what's frustrating them about existing software? So we both want to know what they're looking for in the software we're going to build, and part of what's of doing that is understanding what are they frustrated by what's out there, because we don't want to replicate that. And then we also have to be sensitive to what technology they have. What technologies are they using to access websites or, the internet in general? What's their tech stack or their equipment look like? What's their internet access look like? And additionally, what other kinds of vulnerabilities do we need to know about? So if we're dealing with certain populations that could be criminalized, that could be surveilled, that could be harmed in a lot of different ways, again, we have to really ensure that as we're building this, we're not causing harm through our own ignorance or even our own excitement to build in a really cool feature. Well, if that cool feature could also be used against people Could be used for surveillance as well. We have to be cognizant of the risks of that. So we move through different kinds of users. We identify them here. Usually we do 3 or 4, depending on the complexity of the software. And again, this is just at a high level to start mapping out some of the user roles. And this is when we start also drafting user stories. So I'm not going to explain user stories here, but most people here will be familiar with the concept. Basically, the little bite-sized little stories of like, can want to do this so that, or no, I can do this so that I can, or I want to have this so that I can, like that kind of phrase in these tiny little stories of every little user helps describe like where the actual software, like what is it actually doing. And we'll list those in our big report through each user role. And so again, we check out and we move on to the next phase, which is the information architecture. We schedule another session. We go back and one thing I think I forgot to mention earlier is each new draft of the report builds on the last one. So this will be the second draft we're doing, which will be incorporating the feedback from all the meetings we've had so far. We build that in, and then we constantly add new drafts into things. So the report's getting bigger, but it's also getting more refined. And the partners themselves will review it to ensure that we got all the language right, that we're actually reflecting what we need to do. And the last phase from Pathfinding really is the information architecture. So this is stuff like designing a sitemap, user flows, wireframes, prototyping. Again, I'm not going to go too much into details of this because this is kind of normal tech stuff that's often done pretty much by everybody. You got stuff like, your sitemap, you've got your user flows, and you've got your wireframes. So we'll do like a wireframe prototype where we'll do the classic like low fidelity wireframes and then sometimes the high fidelity wireframes and then a click through prototype. It won't be a full functioning version of the application, but just something that gives the partners a feel for, what the application could look like, how it will function, where are the key features being highlighted. This is really important to not only help visualize what this application or what the software will look like, but how it will feel. It will make it come to life much more than just a whole bunch of words on a sheet of paper. And so again, this won't be the final product. This is just largely for brainstorming purposes to identify certain things and really to, again, get a feel for the app. And same thing, we'll check out after this phase and determine what we need to do next. And the next step after this will be budgeting. Actually, no, next step will be approval. So after each one of these phases, we build on a consensus, and then when the report is finalized, we get it signed. And that's kind of like agreeing that, okay, everything in this one big report, we agree with. We've written it. We think that this is what we want. And now that we have all that captured from our end, from Animiki's end, now we can start budgeting. Now we can be like, okay, this is what we want to do. This is what we want to build. How much is it going to cost? And so the final pathfinding report itself, it's broken down into these 3 phases that I've described earlier. You've got the overview, you've got the users, and then you've got the information architecture. And each section building off the last. So once it's signed, once basically all of these aspects of the software are agreed on, then we will do the budgeting. We'll have to go through every one of the user stories. We'll have to go through the wireframes. We'll have to, again, go through the stuff like, respecting everyone's rights and laws and things like that, and make sure that the user stories don't conflict with any of that. Because again, we have to really ensure we're not causing any kind of harm to anyone. How much is that going to cost? What features can we do at certain price ranges? We can have like different kind of pricing options where maybe we'll build this small functionality in this phase, and then in future phases, as we learn, we will add in new features, or as we build in a bigger budget, because often our partners won't have a ton of money, but they need like, a quick win, a quick prototype or proof of concept, so that not only will they actually have something that's functional and useful right away, but they can also use that to pitch for more funding, for more functionality, for more features and things that they can build off of. So in summary, again, Move slow, empower people. Opposite of move fast and break things. You do not want to do that in Indigenous tech, as I'm sure y'all appreciate. And our partners and the users themselves, they're the experts. We are not tech saviors. We do not believe in this notion that like developers are gods and that, the technologists have all the answers. Like, no, we have certain skills. Our partners have the experiences and they also have skills too. And how do we find a match between these things so that ultimately, again, we're empowering people, we're empowering the users? And how are we learning? How are we iterating? How are we improving ourselves so that we're constantly getting better at this, so that we're sharing our learnings with everyone, so everyone is ultimately benefiting from every single project that we do. So with that in mind, we would love your feedback. Apologies for going longer. I don't even know what time it is anymore. But in the chat, feel free to ask lots of questions, and hopefully we'll have some dialogue back and forth. Any additional feedback or whatever outside of this, feel free to reach either me or Sam. My email address is jeff.doctor@animikii.com. Sam's is samantha@animikii.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn or on Twitter as well. Twitter, I don't know how long for me, but we'll find out. But animikii.com is where you'll always be able to find us. So Nyawe, thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to meeting y'all throughout the rest of the conference.